Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I am Kevin Tulloch Marston, and it is my pleasure as president of the Society for American Soccer History, also known as SASH, to welcome you to our May 2026 First Friday session. Founded in 1993, SASH works to promote, facilitate, and disseminate research into the rich history and heritage of soccer in the United States. You can find us best in two places: on the web at ussoccerhistory.org and on our social media accounts on Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, X, and Blue Sky. Please follow the First Friday sessions at hashtag FFSS so that we can post and repost from our SASH accounts. An excellent reminder that our SASH website, which is maintained by Ed Farnsworth, our communications director, has many excellent resources, including a growing collection of digitized resources ranging from archives across the planet with fascinating historic clips of American soccer heritage. And in that, we encourage you to support our ongoing crowdfunding campaign to digitize more and more material. All of our sessions are available on YouTube and as podcasts. Thank you to Brian Korstadt, who manages this. Indeed, thanks to our amazing volunteer membership for all of our initiatives. Are you working on something that you might like to present at a future SASH session? Then please do reach out to SASH and the board. All ideas are welcome from current or future members to be. If a shorter format would interest you to float some ideas or maybe something that you are not quite yet ready to present in 20 minutes, then we also organize shorter sessions with several speakers. Or if writing is more your thing, then we welcome written contributions for our SASH website on all areas of soccer-related history. If you are not yet a member, you can join SASH through our website. Please click on the Join SASH tab on the SASH website, and you'll be eligible to receive our newsletter. Today, I would like to welcome our speaker, Professor Emeritus Dilwyn Porter from De Montfort University's world-renowned International Centre for Sport History and Culture based in Leicester, UK. Dilwyn is an expert in British sport, and he is the author of multiple books on the history of amateurism, national identity, the famed Corinthians Club, and has written also extensively on economic and commercial history in and beyond sport. Today, Professor Porter will be discussing the fascinating transnational phenomenon of town twinning through a series of sister city games featuring clubs from Worcester, Massachusetts, and Worcester, England, in the late 1920s. Emanating out of the post-World War I British-American Fellowship, this partnership roared into being in the late 1920s as the two cities transferred and traversed the Atlantic to play the beautiful game. And accompanying this session, you will find on the SASH website an essay describing the background of these tours. Dil, we are thrilled to have you. Thank you so much, and the floor or the pitch is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Kevin. It's very generous and very kind of you. I mean, I think what I'll do, I'll just try and tell the story in a sense. It's quite a slightly complicated one. Tell the story about how these tours came about, why the two Worcesters, and where the whole movement to bring the two cities and the two counties, really, which is probably more relevant together, actually goes, and before it finally fades away after this brief surge of activity, really between the mid 1920s and around about 1930. Okay, I mean, you've already mentioned the book about the Corinthians that I wrote with Chris Bolsmann, and I also wrote some other stuff with a guy called Nick Piercy about football tours from Britain to Holland. And tours are very interesting. Sporting tours interest me, I think, for a number of reasons. But I mean, to cut to not to spend too long on preliminaries, as it were. I mean, I was kind of interested in how they fitted into that whole sort of idea of soccer globalizing over the course of the 20th century, and certainly sports tourism or contacts brought about by sports tourism, soccer tourism, were a part of that. And fortuitously, as I was preparing this, I was kind of digging. I'm still working on this. I've got an essay coming out quite shortly in another publication, based on what I'm going to talk about today. But I'm still sort of digging around because I think there's other things I can do with this. And I came across a little article in the Daily Mail, that's the London Daily Mail Atlantic edition, which I think was the one that they kind of aimed at transatlantic travellers in the 1920s, dated the 21st of May, 1927. Headed A Teacher of Games. And it says, England has a remarkable record in the invention and teaching of games. Association football spreads like wildfire in the US. And one day, no doubt, an American soccer team will cross the Atlantic to play test matches, as we usually refer to cricket test matches and soccer as international matches. But never mind. So it shows it's kind of cultural kind of mix up going on there. This is in 1927, and they seem quite oblivious to the fact that, in fact, an American team had already crossed the Atlantic in 1926, which was which was the starting tour, the first tour between the two Worcesters, with the team coming from the States to play in England in September, October 1926. And I was kind of quite interested. I think that there's a lot of there's a lot of assumptions, obviously, about a one-way kind of transmission of sporting activity and sporting knowledge and sporting culture, from moving from a kind of England as the centre or Britain as the centre elsewhere. And obviously, I'd spend a lot of my time challenging that notion. It's obviously a far more complex process than a lot of people believe, although that still resonates to some extent, I think, in, say, the popular press, probably still in the Daily Mail, actually. that kind of Anglo-centricism is not terribly helpful, but it's still around. Anyway, so while I'm looking at this, imagine my surprise, as it were, because I'd stopped working in Leicester, and I was looking for projects around in Worcester that I could work on, because I'm quite well connected with the local archives here. And I looked to see what they'd really got on sport. And imagine my surprise. Whoops, where's this guy gone? Yeah, there it is. I came across this person, and I'm going to talk really at the start about three people that were very important in getting this whole business going. And what I came across, I couldn't believe it, was a scrapbook related to this guy, Percy Harper, who was a famous referee of the 1920s and 30s, or should I say infamous, really, because he refereed top matches in England, refereed international matches. He was a bit of a minor celebrity. But he's probably most remembered in British football history for a decision he made in the 1932 FA Cup final, where he allowed a goal against Arsenal, who were the favourites. Newcastle won the FA Cup in beating Arsenal surprisingly in 1932, when a guy crossed the ball and it was headed into the goal, and subsequently, well, even to the naked eye, for some people, you could see that the cross came in when the ball was well over the line. Harper, however, didn't see it that way. He was not a man to listen really to advice from other people, and he gave the goal. Anyway, so he was involved in one of the first kind of trials of a soccer referee by the media, I think, in a big way here in 1932, and so he became quite famous. He was also the secretary of the Worcestershire Football Association. So he's from Stourbridge in the north of the county. That's where he grew up, and that's where he's based. But he's the secretary of the Worcestershire Football Association, and he's a member of the Football Association Council. So football is his life, really. I mean, he has a job. He's a court official in Stourbridge, but basically he's a referee and he's a football administrator. And he manages I found out from the scrapbook that he'd been to America in 1927 and had been in charge of a team that seemed to be represented. Well, strange, it wasn't actually called a Worcestershire FA team, Worcestershire County FA team, as you might have expected, but represented some organisation called the Worcester Sporting Fellowship. Okay. I also found in his scrapbook You can see there the headline from a Sunday newspaper in Britain that was specialised in sensationalism, and Harper was cashing in on his his moment in the limelight in 1932, and they ran a series of articles about him, about what it's like to be a big referee, and he says he comments really rather unfavorably on US soccer and his experience in back there in 1927, sorry, when Worcester go to the States. So he was the first person that I got interested in. And then I started to find out about somebody else in Worcester, England, that was quite important here. Wait for this guy to come up. Sorry, he's not moving. Hold on. Rachel, just need to move this guy along. You must my daughter's working for my daughters at the moment, so just can't move it on one. Good. So what did you do?
Just press the down.
Oh, well, okay. Sorry. Family intervention there. Okay, so this guy, Sir Arthur Charlton. Now, Charlton was the mayor of Worcester as you can see, in those years. His son was killed at Gallipoli in 1916, and he devoted himself to kind of civic duties thereafter. And he's interested. He's a theatrical impresario, really, and he decides, particularly, it's just after the US enters the war in May 1917. He decides that there's a role. He's very interested in the welfare of troops generally. I guess it's reaction to his son's death. And he becomes very interested in the idea of what can be done for American troops passing through England on their way to and from the battlefields in Europe. And he has this idea of twinning. He's a pioneer, really, of the whole idea of towns being twinned one with another in different countries. He wants to promote sort of international understanding and goodwill through that kind of route. And he starts something he founds in 1918 something called the British American Fellowship, which is designed to actually promote this kind of activity. I don't know if you can see that. Okay, that's an example. That's him explaining in June 1918 what the scheme's all about. British towns and cities would host US soldiers who were on leave, coming back to England on leave from France or somewhere, or were maybe convalescing out in England after they had been wounded in France. So, putting it very simply, the idea was that Worcester, England would host people from Worcester, Massachusetts. Bedford, England would host people from New Bedford. Except York, people in. I mean, in some senses wildly impractical. You can see how it you can see certain difficulties built in there, but he actually was prepared to vary the scheme because he was talking about London in the end, twinning with New York, and I don't know, Sheffield with Pittsburgh, putting two steel towns together because they were very interested. He thought it would work if these places had something in common, whether it be they did the same kind of thing as Sheffield and Pittsburgh would do with, had a connection through both steel manufacturing places, but also if they had the same name. And he thought it would work particularly well for Worcester because Worcester, England, and Worcester, Massachusetts were already linked by historical and sentimental ties. And I think I'll just say a bit about this to explain why we focus on Worcester here, because Worcester, England, Worcestershire, and the city of Worcester itself, there's plenty of football being played, as there still is in Worcestershire and in Worcester, England, but it's not exactly a hotbed of soccer. I mean, football is the main sport most people in England would associate with Worcester is cricket, but and rugby now, but there wasn't much rugby played in Worcester in those days. But certainly, you wouldn't think of Worcester first if you were thinking about setting up soccer tours, unless there was some other reason. And the reasons he thinks the two Worcesters will combine very well. It says the two Worcesters are already linked by historical and sentimental ties. Well, if we take the historical ties first of all, then the secret, if you like, lies in the name. As I understand it, Worcester, Massachusetts, adopted its name in 1664, and it's not. I just assumed for years that it was because some people from Worcester, England, found themselves in that part of the USA. But I don't think it's that at all. I think what it is that the city of Worcester, Massachusetts, derives its name in, as it were, as a matter of honouring Worcester, England, because Worcester, England was the site of the last battle of the English Civil War in 1651, when Cromwell's parliamentarian troops defeated the Royalist armies. And it's a major battle. I mean, Worcester was a big battle of the English Civil War. As traffic passes up the main road now in and out of the city, close to where I live, I like to remind visitors that if they'd been here at the wrong time, they would have found several thousand dead bodies lying around the place, because it was a fairly brutal affair. It was, though, it affected the founding fathers really very much. They tended to look back on that battle as a kind of key moment in history. It was, I mean, if you go to a park here down the road, there's a plaque where a tree was planted, which celebrates a visit by John Adams and Thomas Jefferson in 1786, who wanted to come and see, the place, the ground on which, where freedom was fought for, as they put it. So it's got that kind of, it has a sort of historical resonance. It doesn't go very far in terms of making a relationship between the two cities or the two counties for a long time, but it's always sort of lurking there in the background. Just before the First World War, Worcester City here, the city council sends somebody over with 2 suits of armor, which I don't know, if they're still in the city hall in Worcester, Massachusetts. But these were relics of the Battle of Worcester. And it was a kind of symbolic sort of presentation that spoke to this thing and this relationship. And just before the football tours start in the 1920s, there's a bit of movement going on. There's a guy comes over from the Rotary Club in Worcester, Massachusetts, to speak to Rotarians in Worcester, and he brings a wooden gavel for the chairman to keep order at meetings, which he says is carved from wood taken from the tree under which the Declaration of Independence was signed. Now, whether all this is true or not, I don't know, but the two places thought they were historically significant, right? I think that's quite important. They've got those things binding them together. I think the other thing you have to, and this is where, how when you start a piece of work and you write it up and then you think, well, actually, I've learned something in the process, because if I was starting it now, I wouldn't quite start from where I was in the first place. I don't know if you've ever had that feeling. Well, I think one of the things I learned about these tours that I wasn't expecting was that Kidderminster, which is about 16 miles to the north of Worcester, which is a carpet manufacturing town, and was, one of the principal carpet manufacturing centres of the world until sometime between the First and Second World Wars. Kidderminster also has very close links with Massachusetts and with Worcester in particular, and that's because from the 1860s onwards, there was a lot of emigration of carpet weavers and other people with appropriate skills from Kidderminster in Worcestershire to Worcester, Massachusetts. The key figure there was a guy called Matthew J. Whittle, who ended up with what he claimed was the largest carpet factory in the world in Worcester, Massachusetts, in south side of the city there by the end of the 19th century. He'd gone over in the 1860s, and he'd taken a sort of a kind of new had the presence of mind to take with him his own loom, which was some new sort of adaptation, and he was able to build a successful business career in Worcester, Massachusetts. And he's always going back and forth. He's great. He makes millions, and he never forgets his hometown. And he's a great benefactor. If you go to the local church there now, there's a Matthew P. Whittle chapel. So there's lots of connections between the north of the county of Worcestershire, particularly Kidderminster, and Worcester, Massachusetts. And I think they're probably as important, or perhaps more important in this case. They become more important than the historical connection between Worcester, Mass and Worcester City, England. Because when you read the press reports of the time, people, and certainly people going over to Worcester, Massachusetts from here with the football tours, they say, oh, if you turn up in one of the carpet factories in Worcester, Massachusetts, you meet people from home. It's just like walking into a factory in Kidderminster. Or people come up and watch them training and they say, oh, I'm from Kidderminster. I used to play for Kidderminster Harriers. That's where I learned to play. I'm a native of Kidderminster, England, and I'm glad you're here. So those links are very important. Okay. So the other person, perhaps, I've kind of got slightly ahead of myself there. So the other person I think is very important, and we come to the prime mover on the American side. Who's this guy? Henry Harmon Chamberlain. Now, he seems an unlikely person in some ways to be promoting football tours, because he's a Harvard academic. He sees himself as being, I think, the wise man of Worcester, Massachusetts, as far as I can see. He's a writer, a poet. He's a sort of classical scholar, really, by inclination, I think. I don't think he teaches at Harvard for very long. He's obviously got a significant private income. And he sort of floats around on the fringe of various political movements in America during the First World War, particularly urging people to prepare for war. The most important idea, I think, and this is really what motivates him, I think, in terms of promoting these tours, is that he's a strong advocate of what he always refers to, and what his political allies always refer to as Anglo-Saxonism. And what you've got to remember is why that might have been important, really, in the 1920s. I think. I mean, things we think perhaps now that things were are somewhat rocky in terms of the relationship between the USA and Britain diplomatically and politically. It was a similarly difficult time in the 1920s. You've got a point where, there's two factors really. First of all, Britain owes the USA a lot of money after World War I, and the Brits resent being asked to pay, and the Americans and many people in America think rather resent the idea that they're having to wait for these war debts to be paid off. It's a running sore really in Anglo-American relations in the 1920s. There's also, I think, the other thing is this always mentioned is Anglo-American naval rivalry. Britain thought it ruled the waves with the Royal Navy before 1914. It clearly didn't quite. It couldn't do that in the same way. It was challenged. It saw US naval building as a kind of challenge, and there was some real bitterness around that issue, which lasted really right the way through the 1920s through till about 1930. In fact, there was a famous sort of showdown meeting in the end in Geneva, I think, in about 1927, where things got particularly bad, and you find the people in the British Foreign Office saying things like they can't rule out the possibility of a future war between Britain and the USA, which is kind of, it's being said in those circles, but it's difficult. Now, Chamberlain is the kind of person, I think, who's well connected politically in the States. I think maybe there could be other things going on here. We have to, and I can only speculate about this, and I'm talking this really, this is off the top of my head, really. I've not found any evidence yet to support this, but The kind of people that are putting in, you're operating quite a high level here. You've got Harman Chamberlain sets up this organization called the Worcester County Sports Brotherhood, which is funded really by a lot of the principal manufacturers in the industries in Worcester, Massachusetts. He gets them to kind of bankroll the first tour in 1926, and subsequently the tour back from England to American 27 is, the arrangements of that are clearly heavily subsidized and supported by the local industrialists. But I think what he's really interested in, he sees Anglo-Saxon civilization. I mean, the whole idea of Anglo-Saxon is a bit problematic anyway, but the way he sees it is that, that the future of civilization depends on good relations between Britain and the USA, and that he should do everything possible to promote that. And I think in a way, this is an aspect I want to explore. You have to remember, when you look at the Worcester County Sports Brotherhood in the USA and its opposite number, if you like, in England, which tends to be less supported by industrialists, but more by the kind of the great and the good of the county. People like Lord Cobham, who's the Lord Lieutenant. He's you look at the list of people, and on that committee is Stanley Baldwin. Baldwin's Prime Minister. I mean, he's a very important person. He's a Worcestershire man. He's the MP for Bewdley in Worcestershire. And I don't suppose he takes a very active part in this, but it's very significant that he's involved. I just wonder if there's a little bit of backdoor, setting up a backdoor route here, because there's a lot of other contentious issues coming up. And, Cobham knows Chamberlain, Charlton knows Cobham, Charlton knows Chamberlain knows other people in the States, particularly important manufacturers and businessmen. They all know Baldwin. Baldwin turns up now and again when the idea was he was going to kick off the first match, which I don't think he does. But when the American visitors are entertained before they leave finally in 1927, they get the Pilgrim Society, which is another organization that facilitates at a very high level these kinds of connections, gives them dinner in London, and Baldwin turns up because he just happens to be around and talks to them like old friends, etc. So there's something going on here, I think, maybe in the 1920s. And I think it's interesting. The other thing I've really discovered, I think, in doing this, I started out from a Worcestershire, England perspective, and I suppose what I've written so far has been largely from that perspective. But I get the impression that the real push for all this is coming from the States. And you might want to think about the extent to which people in Massachusetts in the 1920s, and my knowledge of American history is obviously much sketchier than yours will be, how people who regarded themselves as Anglo-Saxons would consider themselves under threat, as it were, and a need to sort of express their sense of identity through this, and how important maintaining the link with England would be. Okay, we will get round to football in the end, by the way. Soccer, of course. Okay, so this is basic. Chamberlain spends a lot of time going between the two Worcesters before any of this happens. He comes twice. And you can see here, he's interviewed by the local paper, one of the pioneers, if not the inspirer, of the scheme for connecting the peoples of the two areas in England and America bearing the same name. Okay. Right, so let's get round to the football. The first tour in 1926. What we've got a picture there from, I think, the Boston Globe, which is quite useful source for this. George Collins, who, of course, well known to you. He's the football and cricket editor of the Boston Globe. Didn't he take the US team to the Olympics in 1924? He's a guy I'm very interested in, really. He brings a team over from the Worcester County Sports Brotherhood to England in 1926. And the team in 1926 the idea is it's going to be teams of working men meeting each other on the football field. So most of these players in 26 were players who came over from the States, were working for people like Draper's Corporation, who were big manufacturers of textile machinery, who were working for Whittles, the mill in South Worcester, which was turning out carpets. Most of them were from those two, in fact, at that time. And Morgan Construction, another big company in the area, they all had teams. This is part of the industrial welfare movement, of course, of the 1920s and 30s on both sides of the Atlantic, to encourage workers, to encourage good industrial relations, if you like, through promoting sporting activities. So, and they all have teams in local leagues in Worcester, Massachusetts. They're all amateurs, and they're sent over from the USA, or they come over from the USA in 1926, and they play a series of games in England. They play 4 games in Worcestershire against teams mainly drawn from the local amateur leagues. And they also play a kind of representative Worcestershire 11. And they also play a final match in Oxford against Oxford University Centaurs, who are the kind of second 11 of the Oxford University soccer squad. So it's really interesting. They come over in 1926. They play these games, and I think you get a real sense of how these tours are going to go from these first encounters, if you like, at the time. What happens? First, I would say let's talk about what happens on the field. I mean, these matches are so sort of random in a way. They're not. You can't really judge much about the comparable state of kind of grassroots football in England and America from these encounters. But most of them, on this first tour, the home side wins. The Americans, in fact, only win one of the games, and they lose the other 4. The local press coverage is quite interesting. It kind of suggests that the American players are, very enthusiastic and maybe slightly over physical for soccer players, and there is that. But beyond that, there isn't very much said about the style in which they played. It's quite hard to discern a particular kind of the way the matches might have went. Most important, perhaps one of the most interesting things, I mean, obviously they were desperate for all these matches to be conducted in a very good spirit and to be an example of Anglo-American harmony. And the key contentious issue really on the field was substitutes. In this country, the Football Association tended to frown on the use of substitutes. They would occasionally allow them for friendly matches, or but if anything serious or competitive, they tended to think it was just tough luck. If somebody got injured, you just had to play with 10 men and accept that was the way life was. It was character building, and you certainly get a sense of that. In this 1926 tour. Collins makes it clear that they've accepted that they'll play under Football Association rules and that substitutes are not going to be allowed in these matches. But in the first game, I mean, they've only got I think 13 players with them. The goalkeeper gets quite a serious injury actually in the first game, about halfway through at Stourbridge. Harper's refereeing, and it's a friendly match. The team from Worcester, Massachusetts, is losing, so they start to get their goalkeeper, a substitute on in place of their goalkeeper. The crowd's all for it. I mean, it's not a massive crowd, but they all say, "Yeah, let him play. Let him play." Everyone says let him play, apart from Harper, who decides to stand on his dignity as a football referee and says, no, we're playing the English FA's rules here, and so I'm not going to allow him on. So in the end, the guy doesn't get on the pitch. So the Americans play with 10 men. They lose 5-2. The Barrow's Worcester Journal, which is the main local newspaper here, says, well, what they've got to learn is there's a better moral aspect, as they put it, to losing heavily with 10 men than it would be to lose more narrowly with 11. And there's a kind of patronising tone in some of the reporting here on those lines. When they play in Evesham, for example, I think what's very instructive really is that the local paper reported the Evesham select team beats them 4-2, and it says something like, well, yeah, the Americans, they were very industrious and they tried very hard, but you know, they didn't, you know, football doesn't come naturally to them, as it were, you know, whereas our boys, you know, somehow, you know, they were naturally superior, and however much the Americans huffed and puffed, then, you know, good luck to them, but they weren't going to win. It was something instinctive in the way the Englishmen played, which was nonsense, of course, really, because more than half the American team had been born in the UK anyway. So quite how this was supposed to work, I don't know. Okay. Anyway, so there's the subs question, but basically with these tours, what happens off the field is as important as what happens on the field. What happens off the field is that you realize straight away that there's something going on here. These people, these players coming over from America, the most important thing about them really is they have to be seen. They have to be visible, an embodiment, if you like, of the idea of Anglo-American harmony. So they spend, I mean, I'm amazed actually you could get the team out sometimes, because they seem to be spend most of their time being wined and dined and taken out and about. So they go on factory visits. They go on, you know, they're taking on tours of interesting places in England. They spend time with the hobnobbing with Lord Cobham and his friends, and Lord Beecham was another rather exotic aristocrat from around here, at Maddersfield, which is the site of Evelyn Waugh's what's it called? Brideshead Revisited, one of the famous sort of louche novels of the 1920s and 30s. They kind of they're always, you know, they're always at a factory somewhere. They hardly ever, well, they seem to be able to get a little bit of training in. They're at a banquet somewhere. Somebody's entertaining them. They go to the theatre, and you know, there's a sense here, you know, they're welcomed as brothers, as it were. The official welcome is very much as brothers. So they go to the theatre in Worcester. The orchestra plays music, which the local press back in Worcester, Massachusetts says makes the American heart swell with pride. And they stand up and they know they've got to respond to this. They're being welcomed by their Anglo-Saxon brothers. And so they stand up and they start singing. And so they give them, you know, they sing in harmony, and they, you know, and they respond in this way, and the audience loves it. So you've got this kind of thing going on all the time, as well as, you know, what happens on the field. And really, it's the welcome that they get, and they do seem to be welcomed, and sort of, yeah, the matches are become almost irrelevant, really, as they sort of whisked around from one place to another. I mean, it's amazing when you look at their itinerary. When they play in Evesham, there's a days mapped out for them. You know, they've driven over from Worcester to Evesham, which is about 20 miles. They met there. Then somebody takes them on a tour of you know, local beauty spots and archaeologically significant sites, where they're given little lectures along the way by some local historian. They're taken to Witchenford, which is where some distant relative of George Washington had once lived. They go on this kind of vast tour of the south of the county of Worcester in the morning. Then they have what's described as a banquet lunch given to them by the mayor of Evesham and the council, and then they go and play in the afternoon. I mean, the whole thing is kind of, you know, is very, and this pattern repeats itself time and time again. And it's very much about being seen. very much about being seen. When they play at Stourbridge, the first game, they're picked up by car from Worcester and they're taken up to Stourbridge, which is about 25 miles away to the north of the county. And the cars have got big placards on saying who they are. And they get to Stourbridge. They're playing in midweek, Thursday afternoon. It's not going to be a huge crowd, but the town is, there's banners everywhere. There's bunting all over the place. It's probably the most exciting thing that's ever happened in Stourbridge on a Thursday afternoon ever. So they turn up and they're there to be seen. And basically, if we go on to the reciprocal tour in 1927, the same thing happens. It repeats itself on a much grander scale, it must be said. I think the thing that's different in a way is that the hospitality in the States works on two levels. Really, it's corporate to a large extent. So the matches they're playing factory teams basically. So the matches are being staged by these big corporations. Whittles spent an enormous amount of money on getting their ground upgraded. And providing all kinds of facilities. There's lots of very elaborate sort of displays of that are going to emphasize Anglo-American harmony, the two flags entwined everywhere. Everyone's given the day off work. There's parades of people coming along. I mean, they have a whole day. They have a whole day there, and they have at similar time at Morgan Construction and at Draper's. There's that level of hospitality, and they're also significantly entertained by people who are very much determined to say that they are Anglo-Saxons. They're entertained by the Anglo-Saxon Society, by the what are they called? I think they're called the League of St. George, in brackets Prince Consort branch. There's an English social club in South Worcester where they turn up in 1927 and find that they have a whole evening of with people who actually come from Kidderminster there. So this whole emphasis is on this unification. I was just going to find. I mean, this is the kind of thing you would find when they were entertained for dinner in 1920 something. On the menu, that they would have picked up, there was a piece of verse about. Of course, I can't find this now. It says something. It's a terrible bit of verse. Chamberlain would have been absolutely horrified. But the sentiment was basically, everything's red, white, and blue, both the Union flag and the Stars and Stripes, and we are brothers of the blood is basically the theme. So, So they play a series of matches in the States. They're expected. The visitors are expected to do very well. They win the first two. They lose one match to a team called representing the Central Massachusetts League, I think, All Stars, who actually beat them 1-0. And then they draw the two final games against the Worcestershire County Sports Brotherhood team and against a Whittles team before they come back. And again, it's exactly the same kind of thing going on. Now, what goes on the field on this tour, what goes on the field is important. Harper gets permission before he goes, taking this team of Worcestershire working men. There's a slightly different kind of complexion to it, simply because I think the local economies are different and they produce different kind of working men. It's got a few people who are working in agriculture in the Worcestershire team who go over, and it's got people that go over to who are working in the motor industry up in on the edge of Birmingham, which is right at the north of the county, and people working in engineering works in Worcester itself, and people with the carpet industry in Kidderminster and so forth. A couple of railway workers, people like that. And an Oxford graduate, a proper gentleman amateur who I think was on the trip because I may be wrong here, but he seems to be a friend of Lord Cobham. So they're on this trip. The football again is almost irrelevant. There's a couple of quite exciting 3-3 draws which end the tour. Harper seems to go along with this quite happily. And yet in 1932, he says he wasn't very happy with the whole thing. He's appalled by the standard of refereeing in the USA. He was so appalled that one match was played at the New England County Fair, got the biggest crowd because you could watch them, you could pay your entry fee, and watching the match came free with that. And Carper says he could barely stay in his seat because he's so outraged by the refereeing. He doesn't actually say what it was, but he says, this is terrible, and he's fuming and angry. Thinks his team's been treated in some way, and they let him. As a result, they let him referee the final game, which passes off uncontroversially. He says nothing about all this for 5 years until he's being paid by Thompson's Weekly News to actually put his thoughts on paper or his memories on paper. But I think he was generally cheesed off for two reasons. One, I think, was possibly he despite the immensely hospitable American hosts, he did feel. He felt somehow his honor as a referee was being impugned by all this, and they really didn't know how to do it in the right way, and he was the man to tell them. And I think the other thing really was that he was out. I think he was a kind of rather how can I put it? I don't think he got on very well with his own team. I think he bossed them around a little bit too much. He was very, very. He actually reflected, he was told, look after these boys, make sure they behave, they're ambassadors. And as he said, my experience was one word from me and they did as they liked, which seems to suggest, the tour didn't go quite the way he wanted. We come back to that. USA come back to, there's a gap of a year, and then the USA come back to Old Worcester, England, as it's referred to in the press in the USA. They come back in 29. They play 5 games again, slightly different itinerary, but exactly the same kind of experience of touring. Being paraded around, basically, generally looking at being as I said, the embodiment of this idea of Anglo-Saxon unity. One of the things that's a little bit different, I think, is that there's a lot of Scandinavian immigration also comes later than the British immigration into Worcester, Massachusetts, and you do get some Scandinavians starting to appear in those matches in 1929. Only a couple, but they're there, and that has sort of resonates later on in 1930. Okay, so I could tell you endless stories about all the places they went and whatever, but we haven't. I mean, you've got the message, I think, by now. So what happens in 29 is that the Americans actually do very well in England. They actually perform better than the hosts. And I think what happens in 1930, I mean, these matches in one sense mean nothing, but I think it does lead to a sort of reaction in England, in the Worcestershire Football Association, who are sort of collaborating with the Sports Brotherhood in putting these teams out. And I think what happens is they decide they can't really let themselves be beaten in the same way. So what you get in the Worcestershire party that goes out to Worcester Mass in 1930 is a sort of sprinkling of players who are definitely, I would say, semi-professional. They're not going to take a chance on getting humiliated. I mean, there's one guy goes is a particularly good player who is playing in North Worcestershire. Is clearly, I mean, like a lot of, I mean, I'm sure it's the same everywhere. A lot of so-called amateur players were if they were any good, were able to command payment for their services, and indeed, it was a fairly open under the counter arrangement. And they take a couple of these players out. One guy in particular I know the goalkeeper who played for Crystal Palace, who are in the Football League, and the one of the players was a particularly good player who went on to have a long career with West Bromwich Albion and various other clubs in the English League, and was turned, the reporting of the tour coming back from the States, he was very much the star player. And so they have a basically almost a clean sweep of matches when they go on the tour in 1930. And then basically, well, there's the team coming back. This is the USA going to England in 1929. Right, record-breaking invasion of Worcester, England, says the Boston Globe, which is basically Collins. England to the USA in 1930, because they've got this. I think they've taken the trouble to put this fairly strong side out. They win most of the matches quite easily. The interesting thing is there's one match here against the Scandinavian Select 11, which is quite an interesting development. They're apparently honorary Anglo-Saxons. So where does it all go? I'll finish this quickly. We can get talking. Well, it doesn't go anywhere after this. And it doesn't go anywhere, I think, because of some fairly obvious reasons. There's a lot of warm words. Yes, we're going to, we'll keep this going. It's terrific. But there's not really much contact following this final tour and no more soccer exchanges. I think probably for financial reasons. It's quite clear, for example, that the Worcestershire Sports Fellowship is actually running at a loss by this time. They're asking the Worcestershire Football Association to subsidise them, so it's not a kind of self-supporting thing anymore. And I think there's certainly in the early 1930s in England as in the USA, but perhaps to a slightly lesser extent, justifying expenditure on a tour of this kind, which would be, you can imagine, you'd have to give, somebody working in a factory in the West Midlands somewhere here, can I have 5 weeks off to play in the States? Will you release me? That's not going to go down too well on a HR from an HR perspective in 1930, whereas you might have got away with it in 1925, 26. I think it's basically they make a loss. They actually have to play a series of charity matches in the mid 1930s to pay off the money they've been lent by the Worcestershire Football Association to finance these American tours. I think on the American side, certainly you get a sense it all goes very quiet in 1930. I mean, there's one of the people on the tour from Worcester to America in 1929 says, he thinks, the people are all telling him there, the industrialists he meets are telling him that, they're getting over the Wall Street crash in 29, things are going to look up, etc., etc. But of course, we know it didn't happen that way. And then there's a very, very deep economic depression which follows. And I think this finishes the tours. There's very few contacts really between the two Worcesters again after that. It does, however, make leave some kind of imprint. There's a guy that goes on the 1932 tour, and I'll just give this as an example, who is a local politician from Stourbridge. I think he later on becomes the mayor. He's knocking around. He's a civic dignitary in Stourbridge and local. He's a retailer, actually, runs a furniture business. And he is very interesting. He comes back and he's very, very enthusiastic about the whole business. He says, he goes around local Rotary clubs talking about his time in America, and he says things like America, as he said, the America is a wonderful country and the American people are a wonderful people. So he sort of bought the whole message, and he's bringing this back and he's talking about this right the way through the 30s every time he's asked to recount his experiences. And he uses this kind of theme, I sense, reappears in the early 1940s when American troops are actually based in Britain again. Because he actually says, I just come across notes for a speech he obviously made several times from the early 1940s, which points out, it starts out by saying he'd been to the States in the 1930s with his football team. They'd been treated like royalty in Massachusetts. Not one of our boys who went to the USA would have anything but the most friendly feelings towards the USA and vice versa. Now American troops were here again. It was important to go out of your way to make friends. So these tours are about, I think, might have against there's a nice little article he wrote in a Journal of Sport and Tourism about the significance of sports tours. And he says something like, this is about sport and tourism, but it's more than the sum of the two. And I guess that's the sort of point at which I can end and hand over to you. Okay.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dil. That was
that okay?
So many things to pick up on. Do you want, for this part, do you want to go ahead and cut your screen off, and then we can see each other a little bit better for the discussion?
Right.
We can always pop things back up on the screen.
Let me get
there's I was particularly interested that just on that one program. There's an image. I guess it's Worcester Cathedral in England. What is the building in the Worcester Mass? Is that also a church, or is it a civic building? I couldn't. It was still a little bit small.
Sorry, what's the Mass one? And it's actually, I think the Worcester Mass program, which I put out, which was from, the two Worcesters meeting 1927. Yeah, I think it's the City Hall.
It's okay. Interesting. So one is the church, one is the City Hall. Very interesting.
Well, go on.
No, that's all right. We'll pick up on that, but I don't want to monopolize.
I just
happily open up for any comments or questions for Dil. If anybody wants to get things kicked off.
Well, I've got something that doesn't really have anything to do with the soccer, but I was really interested in how Worcester, Massachusetts got named. I didn't know that before, but it follows exactly the town that I grew up in, Reading, Massachusetts.
Oh, yeah.
In 1644, it was named after Reading, England, because the people here sided with Parliament over the Royalists, and Reading kept going back and forth. But it's almost the same story.
Well, it's kind of interesting here how, there's a big discussion at the moment about, how Worcester doesn't make enough of its English Civil War heritage. And then one of the reasons for that is that, of course, Worcester was actually besieged twice in the English Civil War, but once by one side, once by the other. And people in Worcester got used to surviving, and they realized in 1660 that to survive, it was a good thing to concentrate on the bit of their history where they were uncompromisingly royalist. And so the city brands itself as the faithful city, faithful to the monarchy in war and peace. And so the Battle of Worcester itself, whatever its ideological significance, has been a slight embarrassment to the city fathers here over the years. So I'm all for putting the history back into it. I'm kind of with Cromwell really there. And I think it's a kind of very interesting kind of thing that I'd never thought about before until I came across that. But I knew vaguely that Jefferson and Adams had been to Worcester, but I had no idea that they revered Worcester so much for those reasons.
Good. I have a actually similar. I think it functions as a follow-up to this. I was noticing as Alan, I note that both of us as natives of Massachusetts have particular interest.
Yeah.
This is a topic. There are at least two names that I noted that were names of places in England that actually are also very similarly names of places around in Worcester County. That were mentioned. There's a Sturbridge, Massachusetts.
Yes.
And there's Sturbridge. I can't do it with your accent, but Starbridge.
Yeah.
And then Kidderminster and Westminster, obviously, are not quite the same, but there's a very clear etymology that is from not exclusively from the area, but Kidderminster being in the area. Westminster is also in Worcester County area. I'm curious if there's I've never seen any or heard anything that talked about how similar names were grouped similarly as they came from the old world to the new. And I'm curious what sort of factors would have led to that if you happen to know.
Well, I think it was just that. I think it was just Charlton, who was behind that scheme, was he was a very successful entrepreneur. He was good at selling shows. That's how he made his business. how he made his money. And he basically, I think, thought, well, this is an easy one to kind of pursue, really. The other one that's always mentioned, they're always hopeful, it never seems to happen, was Rochester, which is down in Kent in England. It's another cathedral town, which of course, there were lots of suggestions that there was going to be a similar arrangement between Rochester, New York and Rochester, Kent. I've never come across that going anywhere, but it keeps coming up. Yes, this is going to expand. I mean, what I think they had in mind here was that that would be the sort of basis of the scheme. It would allow towns to kind of, it would provide a sort of spurious logic to the whole thing, to the whole arrangement. Of course, it was never tested. If it had been tested and it had gone ahead on that basis, it would have fallen flat on its face, really, because, they're not necessarily comparable places anymore, even if they've got the same name. It was never really tested because he started the scheme in June 1918 and the war's over by November. So it hardly got going, but about, as far as I can see, he's saying 250 towns in England had signed up to this scheme by that time. But nothing else comes of this, really. In the end, the British American Fellowship, which he starts, is one of a number of organizations founded round about the time of American entry into World War I, which serve a short-term purpose, as it were, and then disappear. I mean, the fellowship is swallowed by the English-speaking Union eventually. What it comes down to in Worcester in the 1920s is it encourages children in schools in Worcester, England, to write to children in schools in Worcester, Massachusetts. That kind of scheme, That's the extent of the contact. I mean, the first time I talked about this to a group of people, there's a local twinning association here, but they're always saying that the twinning with Worcester, Massachusetts is relatively weak, possibly just a function of distance. But the twinning movement took off in this country after World War I, and it was mainly places in Britain twinning with France or towns in France or Belgium, or even with Germany, in order to promote Anglo-German relations. But the American connection seemed to die, really. I mean, the Mayor of Worcester, Massachusetts comes here in, I think, 1933 on a brief visit. And he's there when they open the new bridge and this kind of thing. And there's the usual kind of platitudes, but nothing practical really coming of this. It sort of flattens out, really. I think it's running out of steam in this country, certainly by 1929, because they're obviously struggling to raise the money to get another tour to America underway. They manage it, but then that bankrupts them more or less, so it doesn't go any further at this end.
It's fascinating that there is this continual amnesia of why they were originally. Obviously, we can tell why they were originally twinned, but I think the relationship between it doesn't seem to be a coincidence. I would imagine it's not a coincidence, whether organically or intentionally, that you have towns near each other in England also be towns near each other within New England.
Yeah.
And the idea of how that was planned is sort of belies the intent of, we're going to just make the old world into the new, but ignoring geography. I imagine that there's just so much to spin out of that would be really fascinating.
Well, I mean, I think what Charlton was good at was publicity. I mean, he sold shows every week. So, there's a story to spin, isn't there? Just by focusing on the two names, there's a story to spin, and I think that's what it came down to. And it's I get a sense. If you want, I can. Kevin's read it, but I can pass on the draft that I've already put together. I mean, there's a letter in there. I mean, it's clearly he sends somebody over from Britain to kind of promote this scheme in America, and they're already there around about July 1918, and there's a letter that appears from an American soldier in the Boston Globe not long after that, July 1918, and he says he's delighted by this arrangement because he knows that he's from Worcester, Massachusetts, and he now knows he'll be made very welcome in Worcester, England, and and that he feels very comfortable with that whole thing, and it's it's part of that kind of charm offensive, really, which is going on at the time, necessarily, of course, as wartime allies. The way it's written it looks like a PR job to me. It looks like somebody in the in the PR department of the U.S. Army has said, "Look, it's a good idea to write these." I wouldn't be surprised if they were coming up elsewhere saying, "Isn't this a good idea?"
Without stepping on Chuck's raised hand, I will say that the idea people can suss out where there's not like roots in the concept and would be a PR job compared to having. I think the origins of that would be really fascinating to learn, so that those of us who do tell stories, as all of us do here, aren't repeating the same sort of thing as we go on. So, Chuck, thanks for letting me go on.
Chuck, go ahead.
Great. That was excellent. Thank you very, very much. Really, really fascinating stuff.
Thank you.
I'm from Chicago.
Oh, yeah.
And
To be
a
twinned with
connection you might.
Manchester.
What's
To
that?
be twinned with Manchester, according to
There you go. Well, there is a bit of a twinning that happens 20 some years later than this tour. Gil Heron, the first black player at Celtic, after his Celtic career goes down the tubes, he ends up at Kidderminster Harriers. And plays there. So there's another USA connection, exactly. So I was super happy to hear a proper pronunciation. I've read that word 100 times and I wasn't sure how to say it. So I got something out of that.
You can get really local. The locals around here call it kiddie.
Okay. I'll stick with that. That one I can say easily. My second question, and you may have answered it a bit, was about Percy Harper, the referee. And you had said that he wasn't overly impressed. He had sort of an unfavorable view of the tour. And did that include the quality of play or just the quality of referees?
Well, two things really. I think his specific comments were about American referees. He wasn't just commenting on the matches that they played. He did go and see some other games while they were there, and he says here the standard was low. Well, he tempers his comments, and when I first started looking at this one, and it comes across in that little piece that I've posted on your on your website, which I wrote for another group really here. But the what struck me was the views that Americans had. It told us something about the views, the expectations, if you like, of Americans looking at England and English people looking at America. Because what Americans got when they came to England was kind of cathedrals and colleges and old stuff. Even the industries they looked at. They went to Worcester Raw Porcelain and Worcestershire Sauce Factory, which is here in Worcester, which both date from the 18th century. Effectively, they're old. Even the factories they were looking at were quite old. They didn't. I think on the second tour they might have taken them to the Austin Motor Works in Birmingham, but basically, Worcester by then it's a big centre of mail order retailing. There's probably one of the biggest, one of the kind of British equivalent of Sears. It's here, based in Worcester. They've got big modern warehouse and operation going here. Nobody ever takes the Americans to see that. They've taken something old. They'd have loved, because that's what, that was how they saw it, and that's how the American, looking at the odd fragments that come back, it's country houses and that kind of thing. They're impressed. They try and impress the Americans that way. The other way, what impresses the English people in the States is basically how it is basically that they meet the modern world. There's a guy that I think I quoted in that article. There's a Worcestershire policeman goes out in the first tour, and what impresses him, he's interested in traffic management, and they go to Boston and he describes what he calls a gigantic helter-skelter, by which he means, I think, a multi-story car park. And he's never seen one in his life. He thinks it's just absolutely miraculous. Can't believe it. And what Harper does, he he's really impressed by the kind of the arrangements for sport and facilities of sport in all these big corporations he visits in the States. You know, the changing facilities, just the extent of what's on offer, the kind of modernity of it all. That's what impresses him. But he doesn't. But he kind of. I think I just get the sense. I mean, he's sort of rather uncomfortable. He's a rather pompous individual, to be honest. Is my impression, and I think he's ill at ease because basically he's lost the dressing room, as we would say over here. These players are clearly, you know, as you would. I mean, you know, who's going to get 11 working men from England, or 14, however many they took out, on tour in the States, all expenses paid, in 1927. They're going to want to have a good time, you know.
Right.
And so Harper saying you got to be in bed by 9:30 is not going to go down very well, is it? So, you know, there's that kind of tension there. He obviously feels that his position is being compromised in some way, and I think that makes him generally uneasy. But he's not happy with American referees. He makes that quite clear in these articles. What is quite interesting, I mean, he's an important figure, isn't he, really, in his own way, Collins? I mean, and I think, you know, I started out by saying about how there's a tendency to think about things going one way from England to the USA. There's a great letter by Collins in the Worcestershire archives here, back in Harper's papers, which he writes before the Worcester team goes to America in 1927, and obviously he's an experienced manager, and he says to Harper, I mean, this is really interesting because it's an American giving, you know, a senior English soccer official lessons in how to manage a soccer team, right? Mm-hmm. And it says something about, I think, about Collins's own style. I've got this out here in front of me. Perhaps a little bit of advice from one manager to another would not be out of place, he says, right? You know your players much better than I do. So that anything I could tell you along these lines wouldn't count. But anyway, he says there'll be many little things you must close your eyes to. But above all, Percy, make them understand from the beginning that you are the boss and that your job will be easier. And then your job will be easier. Just as soon as the ship sails, call all the players to your room and have a straight from the shoulder talk with them. Tell them what's going to be what on the trip. You know, it's kind of basic sort of bit of management know-how, isn't it? See that all the players have their shoes in good shape. Boots, I guess we'd say. Take 2 strips with you. We made the mistake of having only one, and your wet weather forced us to send our boys out with wet jerseys. Just kind of, you know, this is like this is kind of an interesting, in its own very small way, it's an interesting sort of bit of reversal. It's advice about soccer coming back to England from the USA. It kind of just alerts us to the kind of complexity of these bilateral relationships and and you can see it starting to work in a way that facilitates globalization.
Sure.
Am I making too much of that?
No. That's quite interesting. I'm curious. Do you know if he saw an ASL game or like in the 20s?
I think he went
had high quality professional leagues.
Yeah, I think he went.
Someone like him.
I think he went to Fall River. I think he went to Fall River. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. That's great. Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Outstanding. Anyone else want to jump in on another question? If not, Dil, I would love. There's a couple other things that stood out to me, if that's all right. The total absence, obviously, of the state in any of this. You know, this is private society speaking to private society through civic organizations.
Yeah.
And it's fascinating because it really is it seems to me, revealing of the world in which both of the two Anglo-Saxon countries are in prior to World War II, prior to the New Deal, prior to the Beveridge Report and things like, you know, the transformation really of the welfare state. And here you have no involvement of the government whatsoever. If I'm understanding you right,
I think you're
You
right,
have
yes.
interesting informal links between people, lots
I
of
think so.
individual relationships,
Yeah.
but there's no real involvement of the state, which
No.
other than an absolute local level where you've got the mayor who's involved, right?
Yeah.
So that seemed. I was wondering. I'd be curious to pick your
Well, I
brain a
mean,
little bit on
well,
that,
as far as
and then just on the question of you made there's one bit in your paper about coming over to a dry country, and we've
yeah.
talked about prohibition,
Mhm.
and this is a fascinating time for this kind of exchange because the U.S. is in the midst of prohibition, and here you've got these touring teams, and I just wonder if you could tease out a little bit more on that as well.
Yeah, well, specifically about did they consume alcoholic beverages while in the USA? I suspect they did, maybe because this is one of the reasons I think Harper became. There's just a sense in one or two things that are said about they were on the way back. They came back from New York. Actually, they've sailed out of New York and they spent some time in New York. And you get the impression that that's when things really fell apart between Harper and the team. And so I suspect that a few of the lads decided on a night out. And I'm sure if there'd have been any possibility of consuming an alcoholic beverage by that time, they would have done so. But on your broader question, well, of course, there's a tendency for this. Well, I mean, there's very much an arm's length relationship between the state and sport. Sport wasn't really considered to be a matter in which the state would involve itself. It was something which people did, for their own amusement, one way or another. But I think there is a tendency, a slight tendency, people are beginning to become aware, and I think particularly this applies. Well, it becomes more apparent in the 30s. Of the idea that you can use sport as a form of kind of soft power. It's kind of part of this sort of the whole area of this whole kind of area of how do you kind of facilitate good relations. I mean, because our scheme is, it floats on platitudes about goodwill and blood brothers and all this kind of thing. Endless speeches. I mean, the US ambassador turns up actually in 1927 in Worcester, which says something about the kind of high-level connections they had. And he makes this rather ridiculous speech where he says he can assure them that there's only one thing that an American team likes more than licking an English team, that's being licked by one. Which seems to be the most bizarre thing to say, frankly. And I don't think people from the, as far as you can tell, I don't think people actually, I think they were wondering what they'd heard, That was very strange, but there's that sense that we've got to keep things on a nice, That I think it's as I say, it's a display. It's an advertisement for this relationship that means so much. I think to people like Chamberlain, and you can see that having a sort of backdoor route that would, because Lord Cobham, he's Baldwin's neighbour in Worcestershire, and Baldwin's on this committee. There's access, isn't there? I think there's just other things going on here that are taking quite close to the heart of the state, but are deliberately not. They're deliberately keeping a kind of Chinese wall between them and the actual arrangement of the tours. I mean, there is certainly in Britain in the 30s, there's a much more sense of sport being used in that way, or being part of that. I mean, maybe the Brits are a bit reluctant to admit it, but they certainly, they certainly become aware of it through cricket. There's a very controversial tour called the Bodyline Tour to Australia in 1932 or 2 or 3, which everyone says nearly because the Australians think we're cheating, basically say that leads to high level diplomatic exchanges and talk about Australia leaving the Commonwealth and all that, which it wasn't going to happen, but there's a sort of breakthrough point, and there's matches between Britain, football matches, soccer matches between Britain and Germany, certainly in the 1930s. Match in Tottenham in 1934, and then of course there's that famous match where the English team gives the Nazi salute in 1939 in Berlin. So, I mean, there's a sort of sense in which sport is becoming very much part of this. And I think, yeah, but it's not quite there by 1920, the mid 1920s. This is a kind, and it's a, I mean, the other thing though, I think, we sort of assume, we know that this didn't come to much in the end as a long-term thing, but at the start, and really in 1920, 27, 28, 29, people like Chamberlain and Cobham in England, and Charlton are talking about this. Oh, let's extend it to other sports. Let's extend it to other towns. It's still talking about it as some kind of mass movement that will unite the kind of, will mean that the English working man and the American working man understand each other so much better.
Thank you, Dil. Anyone else? A last question or another point? Good. All right. Well, well, thank you very much, Dil. I think we're at 90 minutes, so that's a good time to call to blow the final whistle. I will simply just remind our listeners to tune in to our next SASH session on Friday the 8th of June, where we will be welcoming Michael Lewis to speak about his next book, Around the World Cup in 40 Years, an American Sports Writer's Perspective. So please be sure to log in a month's time for our next session. If you will all join me in thanking Dil for a really wonderful, informative, and interesting session about town twinning today. Thank you so much, Dil, for being with us.
Well, thank you for the invitation, and it's really great to meet you all. I hope I am a member. I shall try and tune in, and I shall follow SASH's activities with interest. And if anyone wants the full draft, as it were, that you've seen, just get in touch with me and I'll send it over.
Great. Well, thank you so much.
It's a pleasure. Absolute pleasure. Thank you. Really enjoyed your company.
Thank you.